You're not supposed to be here." The words landed before Amara even reached the velvet rope, the guard's eyes sliding over her like she was invisible and exposed at the same time. And for a second, she almost believed him, almost turned back, almost forgot the way $5,000 had felt when it hit the table earlier that afternoon. Crisp, clean, impossible to ignore, the kind of money that could quiet a hospital bill or buy another month of breathing room. The kind of money people like Ethan Cole spent without thinking. And now here she was, standing under chandeliers that glittered like a sky she'd never belonged to, wearing a gown that wasn't hers, heels that pinched just enough to remind her every step was borrowed, temporary, conditional, and still that thin plastic band around her wrist read staff in bold black letters, like a truth no amount of silk could hide, like a label the room had already decided for her before she even spoke a word. And behind her the city hummed in late evening traffic while inside the gala pulsed with quiet laughter, crystal glasses clinking, voices low and polished, the kind of place where people didn't raise their voices because they never had to, where power was assumed, not proven, and she could feel it pressing in from every direction as she stepped forward anyway, lifting her chin just enough to steady herself. Because backing down now would mean more than losing the money. It would mean confirming everything they already believed, that she didn't belong, that she was just the help, just someone who cleaned up after nights like this without ever being invited to one. And for a brief moment, she caught her reflection in the glass doors, the soft shimmer of the dress, the tension in her shoulders, the hesitation she tried to hide, and she remembered the way Ethan had looked at her when he made the offer, not unkind, not exactly cold, just certain, like he was solving a problem, and she happened to be the easiest answer. "One night," he'd said, sliding the envelope toward her without ceremony. "Just stand next to me, smile when needed, nothing more." And she had nodded because the math made sense even if nothing else did, because sometimes survival didn't leave room for pride. But now as the guard's hand hovered just slightly in front of her path, not touching, just blocking, she felt something tighten in her chest, something that had nothing to do with money. "I'm with Mr. Cole," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, and the guard's brow lifted just enough to show disbelief before his gaze flicked past her, scanning for confirmation that hadn't arrived yet, and behind him a group of guests turned, curiosity sharpening into something else as their eyes landed on her, taking in the details, the dress, the posture, the tag on her wrist, connecting pieces in a way that didn't need words. And she could almost hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. How did she get in here? And then the whisper, softer but sharper. Why is she here? And she swallowed, forcing herself to take another step, because if she stopped now she might not move again. And that's when she saw him, Ethan Cole, standing just beyond the entrance, perfectly at ease in a tailored tuxedo that fit like it had been made for him, because it probably had, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, like this entire world bent naturally around him. And for a second their eyes met, and something flickered there, recognition, maybe expectation, maybe nothing at all, and she waited, just a heartbeat, for him to step forward, to say something, to make it clear that she belonged beside him tonight, that this was part of the arrangement, that she wasn't a mistake standing at the edge of a room that didn't want her. But he didn't move, not yet, and that silence stretched just long enough to hurt, just long enough to make her question everything she had agreed to, everything she had told herself to justify being here. And the guard shifted again, ready to turn her away, ready to restore the order this place depended on. And in that moment Amara understood something with a clarity that surprised even her, that this night was never just about standing next to a man for money. It was about whether she would shrink into the space they had already assigned her or step into one they hadn't imagined. And without waiting for permission, without looking back, she moved past the guard, past the hesitation, into the glow of the ballroom where the music swelled and conversations paused just slightly as she entered, every step echoing louder in her own mind than it did on the polished floor. And somewhere behind her the door closed with a soft click that sounded almost final, like a line had been crossed, like there was no easy way back. And ahead of her the crowd shifted, making room but not welcoming, watching but not understanding. And she kept walking, straight toward Ethan, the weight of every gaze pressing against her, the word staff still circling her wrist like a quiet accusation. And for The first time since she said yes to that envelope. She wondered not what this night would cost her, but what it might reveal about everyone in this room, including him. $5,000 is not for the night, Ethan said earlier that afternoon, his voice calm, almost detached, as if he were discussing numbers on a spreadsheet instead of a person sitting across from him. It is for the agreement that nothing about tonight becomes personal. And Amara had watched his hand rest lightly on the envelope, not pushing it toward her yet, not pulling it back either, just letting it sit there between them like a line neither of them had crossed, and the sunlight from the tall window behind him had painted the edges of everything in gold, softening the sharpness of the moment, but not changing its meaning. Because the truth was simple even if the room tried to dress it up. He needed someone to stand beside him, and she needed the money, and everything else was just silence filling the space in between. Why me? She had asked, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. Because nothing about this made sense on the surface, and Ethan's eyes had flickered for a brief second, like he had already prepared the answer but did not particularly care how it sounded. Because you will not pretend longer than necessary, he said. And you will leave when the night is over. And that had been it. No compliments, no reassurance, no illusion of something more, just a transaction clean enough to almost feel honest. And she had almost laughed at that, because honesty was not supposed to feel this uncomfortable, and yet here it was sitting in front of her in the form of a sealed envelope, and she had thought about her mother's voice on the phone that morning, weaker than it used to be, trying to sound stronger than it felt, insisting she was fine, insisting everything would work out, and she had known better. She had known exactly how much everything cost, down to the last dollar, and suddenly the number inside that envelope had stopped being abstract and started becoming time, more chances, more space to breathe, and that was when Ethan finally pushed it toward her, just a few inches across the polished table, not forcing it, just making it reachable. You can say no, he added, not looking away from her, not softening his tone, just stating it like a fact that did not carry much weight. And she had looked at the envelope for a long second, long enough to feel the weight of every reason she should refuse it, every instinct telling her that nothing about this was as simple as it sounded. That standing next to a man like him in a room like that would cost something she could not measure yet. But then she reached forward anyway, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. And in that moment the decision stopped being about pride and started being about survival. What are the rules? She asked, because if she was going to do this, she needed to understand exactly where the boundaries were drawn, and Ethan leaned back slightly, as if this part was easier, more familiar. You arrive with me. You stay close, you speak when spoken to, and you do not let anyone turn this into something it is not, he said. Each word precise, controlled, leaving no room for misunderstanding. No personal questions, no stories, no attachments. And she nodded slowly, absorbing each condition, because they sounded simple until you realized how much they required you to erase. And for a moment she wondered if he understood that. If he understood that asking someone to be nothing more than a presence meant asking them to hide everything else they were. But she did not say it out loud, because that was not part of the agreement, and instead she asked the only thing that still mattered. And after tonight, and Ethan did not hesitate, after tonight, we go back to exactly what we were before, and there was something almost final about the way he said it, like he had already closed the door on anything beyond that, like this was not just a plan but a guarantee, and she found herself studying him then, really studying him, trying to understand what kind of man could separate things so cleanly, could decide that a person could step into his world for a few hours and then disappear from it without leaving a trace, and she realized that for him. This was not unusual. This was structure, control, a way to keep everything exactly where it belonged, and maybe that was why he had chosen her, not because she fit into his world, but because she did not, because it made it easier to walk away when the night was over, and that thought should have made it easier for her too, should have made this feel temporary, contained, safe, but instead it settled somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to ignore, because it meant that no matter what happened in that room later, no matter how many people stared or whispered or judged, she was expected to leave it all behind as if it had never mattered. And as she slid the envelope into her bag, feeling its weight settle against her side, She realized that the real cost of tonight might not be what people said to her or how they looked at her, but how easily she would be expected to disappear once it was over. And yet she still stood up from that table, still agreed to meet him that evening, still stepped into a night that had already been decided for her before it even began, because sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that made the most sense. And as she followed him out into the fading light, the city stretching wide and indifferent around them, she told herself one thing, simple and steady, that she would walk into that room on her own terms, even if no one else could see them. The zipper of the dress caught halfway up her back, and for a brief second Amara stood still in the small apartment, arms slightly lifted, staring at her reflection in the narrow mirror, as if the pause itself might tell her something she had not yet understood, because nothing about this moment felt like it belonged to her life. Not the soft fabric brushing against her skin, not the quiet glow of the single lamp that made the room feel warmer than it really was, and certainly not the weight of the evening waiting just beyond her door. And she exhaled slowly before reaching back again, pulling the zipper the rest of the way until it settled into place with a soft, final sound. And suddenly there it was, the version of herself that would walk into a room built for people who had never worried about rent, never counted hours against dollars, never had to choose between dignity and survival. And yet, even as the dress fit perfectly, tailored just enough to make her look like she belonged, something else refused to change, something that lingered in the way she held her shoulders, in the way her eyes searched for exits even in stillness. And she lifted her wrist slightly, glancing down at the thin plastic band that still read staff in bold letters, and for a moment she considered taking it off, slipping it into her bag, pretending it had never been there. But she did not, because removing it would not erase what it represented, and hiding it would only make her forget how easily she could be seen through. And instead she let it stay, a quiet reminder of the line she was about to cross. And when she stepped outside, the cool evening air met her like a contrast she welcomed, sharp enough to clear her thoughts, grounding enough to remind her that this night was real, not some distant idea she could walk away from. And the car was already waiting at the curb, sleek and silent, its presence drawing just enough attention from passers-by to make her aware of how out of place she must look stepping toward it. And when the driver opened the door without a word, she hesitated only a second before sliding inside, the leather seats cool against her skin, the interior smelling faintly of something expensive and unfamiliar. And across from her, Ethan was already there, his posture composed, his gaze briefly lifting to take her in before returning to whatever thoughts he had been holding onto. And there was no compliment, no acknowledgement of the transformation she had gone through to meet his expectations, just a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming she had fulfilled her part of the agreement so far. And for a moment that absence of reaction settled heavier than any criticism could have, because it reminded her that this was not about how she looked or who she was. It was about how well she could fit into a role that had already been defined for her. And the car began to move, the city lights sliding past the windows in long streaks of gold and white, and neither of them spoke, the silence between them not awkward but deliberate, like a boundary neither of them was willing to cross. And she found herself watching the reflection of those lights in the glass, tracing the movement as if it could distract her from the weight building in her chest. And after a few minutes Ethan finally broke the quiet, his voice low, controlled. "Remember the rules," he said, not looking at her, not softening the words, just stating them again as if repetition would make them easier to follow. And she nodded, even though he could not see it clearly, because she had already memorized every condition, every limitation, every expectation that came with this night. And yet something inside her resisted the idea that those rules would be enough to protect her from what was coming. And as the car turned onto a wider street, the building appeared ahead, towering and lit from every angle, its entrance glowing with a kind of quiet authority that made everything around it seem smaller. And she felt her breath catch just slightly, not from awe, but from recognition. Because places like this were not designed to welcome people like her, they were designed to maintain a certain image, a certain balance. And anyone who disrupted that balance would be noticed immediately. And the car slowed to a stop, the driver stepping out to open the door once more. And for a second she remained seated, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the seat, as if she needed that extra moment to gather something she had not yet found. And then she stepped out, the ground beneath her heels solid and unforgiving, the sound of distant conversations and laughter drifting toward her as the doors opened and closed with quiet precision. And she could feel the shift instantly, the way the air changed as she approached the entrance, the way attention moved, subtle but undeniable, and she straightened her posture without thinking, lifting her chin just enough to meet the moment instead of shrinking from it. And as Ethan stepped beside her, finally close enough that their presence formed a single image to anyone watching, she realized that this was it, the point where preparation ended and reality began, and whatever happened next would not be controlled by rules or agreements or carefully chosen words. It would be shaped by how she carried herself in a space that had already decided she did not belong. And as they moved toward the doors together, the soft glow of the chandeliers spilling out to meet them, she made one quiet decision, one that had nothing to do with the money or the agreement or even Ethan himself, that no matter what this night tried to take from her, she would not leave it behind as someone smaller than she was when she walked in. "Smile," someone said as they passed her, but it was not advice. It was expectation, the kind that came with a glance that measured more than it greeted, and Amara felt it the second she stepped fully into the ballroom. The way conversations did not stop, but shifted just enough to include her in their awareness. The way eyes lingered half a second longer than necessary, scanning, calculating, placing her somewhere in a story she had not agreed to tell, and the chandeliers above cast a warm light that softened everything except the truth, because beneath that glow the room was sharp, precise, built on silent rules everyone seemed to understand except her, and she stayed close to Ethan just as instructed, matching his pace, aligning her posture with his presence, becoming part of the image he presented without speaking a word, and for a while it worked, or at least it appeared to, because people approached him with practiced smiles, firm handshakes, voices smooth with confidence, and they acknowledged her only as an extension of him, a detail rather than a person. "Ethan, good to see you," a man in a dark suit said, his gaze flicking to Amara for a fraction of a second before returning to Ethan as if she had already been understood, already categorized. "And you brought." He paused, not finishing the sentence, not needing to, because the implication hung there long enough to be heard without being spoken, and Ethan did not correct him, did not clarify, did not even shift his expression, just continued the conversation as if nothing had happened, and Amara felt that silence again, heavier this time, because it was no longer just uncertainty, it was confirmation, and she held her composure anyway, because reacting would only give them what they were waiting for. And as they moved deeper into the room, the pattern repeated itself, subtle remarks wrapped in polite tones, curiosity disguised as interest, and every time someone looked at her, they seemed to be asking the same question in different ways. How did she get here? And more importantly, how long would she stay? And then came the woman in the silver dress, her smile bright, but her eyes too sharp to be kind. "Ethan," she said, stepping closer, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from those nearby. "You always surprise me." And her gaze slid to Amara, taking in the details with careful precision, the dress, the posture, the wristband that had not gone unnoticed. "This is new," she added, tilting her head slightly, as if examining something unusual, and for a moment the air seemed to tighten around them, the nearby conversation slowing just enough to listen without appearing to. And Amara felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, waiting, testing, and she could have stayed silent, could have let Ethan handle it, could have remained exactly what the agreement required. But something in the woman's tone made that feel impossible. "Amara," she said calmly, her voice clear but controlled, offering her name before it could be taken from her. And the woman's smile did not falter, but something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like she had not expected that response, like she had assumed silence would be easier. "Of course," the woman replied, her tone still pleasant, still polished. "It is always nice to meet new additions." And the pause was intentional this time, deliberate, and Amara met her gaze without lowering her eyes, without giving her the satisfaction of discomfort. And for a brief second the room felt quieter, not because people had stopped talking, but because the tension between them had become its own kind of conversation. And then Ethan spoke, finally, his voice even, measured. "We are here for the foundation," he said, redirecting the moment without addressing it, without acknowledging what had just happened, and the woman nodded, accepting the shift with ease, because for her, the game was not about winning openly. It was about maintaining control, and as she turned away, the subtle smile still in place, Amara understood that this night would not challenge her directly. It would test her in smaller ways, quieter ways, ways that could be dismissed if she reacted too strongly. And as they moved on, weaving through clusters of people who all seemed to share the same polished exterior, she felt the patterns settling in, the rhythm of observation and judgment, the constant awareness of being seen but not truly recognized. And she glanced down briefly at her wrist, at the word staff that still marked her in a way no dress could erase. And she realized that no matter how she stood, no matter how she spoke, that label would follow her through every conversation, every glance, every unspoken assumption. And yet she also realized something else, something quieter but stronger, that the label only held power if she accepted it, if she allowed it to define the space she occupied. And as the music shifted and the room seemed to gather toward the center, where the evening's program was about to begin, she lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in quiet refusal, because if this room was going to watch her, if it was going to measure her against expectations she had never agreed to meet, then she would give them something they had not planned for, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to become smaller just to fit into their version of the night. And somewhere beside her, Ethan remained composed, unaware or unwilling to see the shift taking place, unaware that the role he had assigned her was already beginning to break under the weight of everything this room represented. And as the lights dimmed just slightly and attention turned toward the stage, Amara felt something settle inside her, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity, because whatever this night was meant to be, it was no longer just his arrangement, it was becoming her moment too. The lights softened just enough to draw attention toward the stage, and a low hum moved through the room as conversation slowed into polite silence, the kind that was expected rather than chosen. And Amara felt the shift immediately, the way every movement became more deliberate, every glance more calculated, as if the night itself was tightening into something structured, something controlled. And she stood beside Ethan, close enough to fulfill the role, distant enough to feel the gap between what she was supposed to be and what she actually was. And as the host stepped forward with a practiced smile and a voice that carried effortlessly across the room, Amara noticed how easily people leaned into the performance, how quickly they adjusted their attention to match the rhythm of the event, because this was their world, their language, their stage, and she was still learning how to exist within it without being erased by it. And the host began speaking about the foundation, about generosity and impact and the importance of community, words that sounded polished and sincere, and yet something about them felt distant, like they belonged to a version of reality that did not quite touch the one Amara knew. And as applause followed each carefully delivered sentence, she found herself watching the people instead of the stage, noticing how some clapped out of habit, others out of expectation, and a few out of genuine belief. And it made her wonder how many of them had ever truly seen the people they claimed to support, how many had ever stepped outside rooms like this long enough to understand what those words meant when they were not wrapped in luxury and light. And then the host shifted tone slightly, introducing a segment that would highlight stories of resilience and change, and the room responded with interest, leaning forward just enough to signal engagement. And Amara felt a subtle tension build in her chest, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized the pattern, the way stories were often selected and shaped to fit a narrative that was easier to applaud, easier to accept. And as the first speaker took the stage, sharing a story that was moving but carefully contained, Amara listened closely, her attention sharp, because she understood the difference between being heard and being presented. And somewhere in the middle of that realization, she became aware of a shift nearby, a cluster of guests turning slightly, their attention not on the stage but on her, and she caught fragments of conversation, quiet but intentional. "Is she part of the program?" one voice whispered. "I thought she was with the staff," another added, and the words were not meant for her, but they reached her anyway, slipping through the polished surface of the evening like cracks in glass, and she held her posture steady, refusing to react, refusing to let their curiosity define her presence. And then she felt it, a subtle but undeniable change in the energy around her, as if something had been decided without her knowledge. And she glanced toward the stage just as the host's gaze swept across the room, pausing for a fraction of a second before settling in her direction. And for a moment she thought it was coincidence, just another practiced movement in a well-rehearsed performance. But then the host smiled slightly, a different kind of smile, one that carried intention beneath its surface, and spoke again. Tonight, we also want to recognize the people who work behind the scenes, the ones who make evenings like this possible. And the words were met with polite nods, quiet agreement, because it sounded generous, inclusive, thoughtful, and yet something about the timing, the tone, the way the room seemed to anticipate what was coming next made Amara's breath slow, her senses sharpen, and then the host continued. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones we do not expect to hear. And now the room was watching more closely, curiosity turning into something sharper, something more focused. And Amara felt it settle on her like a spotlight that had not yet been turned on, but was already there, waiting, and she glanced briefly at Ethan, searching for some indication that he understood what was happening, that he would intervene if necessary, that he would at least acknowledge the shift, but his expression remained composed, controlled, as if this was still within the boundaries of the evening he had planned, as if nothing had crossed a line yet, and that silence, that lack of reaction, told her everything she needed to know, that whatever was about to happen, she would face it alone. And then the host spoke her name, clear and unmistakable, Amara. And the room seemed to pause completely this time, conversation stopping, attention narrowing, every gaze turning toward her in unison, and for a brief second the world felt still, suspended between what had been and what was about to be, and she could feel the weight of every expectation pressing in, the unspoken assumption that this would be a moment of exposure, of discomfort, of something that could be observed and then dismissed, and she realized then that this was the test, not the whispers, not the glances, but this, being pulled into the center of a narrative she had not agreed to, being asked to perform a version of herself that would fit neatly into their understanding of the night. And as the host gestured toward the stage, inviting her forward with a smile that was too polished to be genuine, Amara took a slow breath, her mind clear in a way that surprised even her, because in that moment, standing at the edge of something she could not control, she understood that the only thing she truly owned was how she chose to respond. And as she took her first step forward, the sound of her heels against the floor steady and deliberate, she felt the shift again, not in the room, but within herself, because whatever they expected her to be in that moment, whatever role they had quietly assigned her, she was about to decide whether she would accept it or redefine it entirely. The sound of her own footsteps seemed louder than everything else as Amara moved toward the stage, not because the room was silent, but because every sound around her had shifted into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of her breath and the awareness of eyes following her every step, and she could feel it, the weight of expectation building with each inch she crossed. The quiet anticipation of a moment that had already been decided for her by people who believed they understood exactly how this would unfold. And for a brief second she wondered what they saw when they looked at her, whether they saw a story to be displayed, a symbol to be applauded, or simply a mistake that needed to be corrected in the most polite way possible. And as she reached the steps leading to the stage, the host extended a hand with a smile that remained perfectly in place, practiced, and controlled. And Amara accepted it without hesitation, her grip steady, her expression calm, even as she felt the shift in elevation place her physically above the room, while somehow making her feel more exposed than before. And the lights caught her fully now, brighter, clearer, leaving no space for shadows or hesitation. And the microphone stood waiting at the center, simple and unassuming, yet carrying the power to turn a moment into something unforgettable. And for a fraction of a second she paused, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was the point where everything could change, where the version of her they expected would either appear or disappear. And she turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the faces that had watched her enter, the ones that had whispered, the ones that had smiled politely while measuring her presence. And then her eyes found Ethan, standing exactly where she had left him, composed, distant, his expression unreadable, and she realized then that whatever role he had imagined for her tonight, it had already shifted beyond his control, because this was no longer just his arrangement. It was her voice, her moment, her choice. And she stepped forward, positioning herself behind the microphone, the soft hum of the sound system adjusting to her presence. And for a brief second the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting, expecting, ready to receive something that would confirm everything they already believed. And she understood that expectation clearly, the assumption that she would speak with gratitude, with humility, with a kind of rehearsed appreciation that would make the room feel generous for listening, that would allow them to applaud without discomfort, to feel good about the version of kindness they had created for themselves. And she could have done that, could have followed the script they had written without saying a word, could have turned this moment into something safe and forgettable. But instead she placed her hands lightly on the podium, grounding herself in the reality of where she stood, and let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the energy in the room, just long enough to make them lean in instead of relax. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, clear, carrying without effort. "I was not supposed to be up here tonight," she said, and the honesty of that statement moved through the room like a ripple, subtle but undeniable, because it was not what they expected to hear. And she continued, her gaze moving across the audience without avoiding anyone, without searching for approval. "In fact, most of you have already decided where I belong." And there was a shift then, small but real, as people adjusted slightly, as if the words had reached them in a way they had not anticipated, and she could feel the tension building, not hostile, not aggressive, but uncertain, because this was no longer a controlled moment. It was something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into the structure of the evening. And she took a breath, not to steady herself, but to choose her next words carefully, because she understood the weight of what she was doing, the line she was walking between being heard and being dismissed. And she knew that once she stepped fully into this space, there would be no returning to the version of the night that had been planned. And yet she did not hesitate, because something inside her had already made the decision long before she reached this stage. And as she looked out at the room once more, the chandeliers reflecting in her eyes, the silence now deeper, more attentive, she realized that this was not just about proving something to them. It was about refusing to let them define her without ever truly seeing her. And in that moment, standing under the lights with every gaze fixed on her, Amara understood that whatever happened next would not just change how they saw her. It would reveal who they really were when faced with a truth they could not ignore. "You see me now because I am standing under your lights," Amara continued, her voice steady, measured, each word placed with intention as the silence in the room deepened, no longer polite but attentive, no longer casual but focused, and she let her gaze move slowly across the audience, not rushing, not shrinking, allowing each person to feel seen in the same way they had just moments ago chosen to see her. "But a few minutes ago, I was standing at the door, being told I did not belong." And a subtle shift moved through the crowd, shoulders adjusting, eyes flickering, because the statement was simple, undeniable, and impossible to ignore without acknowledging its truth. And she did not raise her voice, did not push for reaction, because she understood that the quiet carried more weight than anything louder ever could. "And I think what surprised me most was not that it happened," she said, her tone calm, almost reflective, but how normal it felt to everyone watching. And now the tension sharpened, not aggressive, not hostile, but uncomfortable in a way that made people aware of themselves, of their posture, of their silence, of the roles they had played without even realizing it. And she could see it in their faces, the moment when observation turned into reflection, when curiosity shifted into something deeper, something more personal. And she paused again, not for effect but for clarity, because this was not about filling the space with words. It was about letting the truth settle where it needed to. And when she spoke again, her voice softened slightly, not in weakness but in control. "Tonight is about generosity," she said, glancing briefly toward the banners that framed the stage. The words about community and support displayed in elegant lettering, about impact, about helping people who need it, and a few heads nodded automatically, as if the reminder aligned with what they already believed about themselves. and she allowed that moment to exist before continuing. But generosity is not just what you give when it is comfortable, she added, her eyes returning to the audience, steady, unwavering. It is how you see people when it is not. And the room seemed to hold that sentence differently, as if it carried a weight they had not anticipated, as if it asked something of them that applause alone could not answer. And somewhere near the front, someone shifted in their seat, a small movement that broke the stillness just enough to make its presence known, and Amara felt it. The change in energy, the way the room was no longer simply listening but processing, questioning, and she knew this was the moment where everything could either close back into something safe or open into something real, and she chose the latter without hesitation. I work in a house where most of the time, I am not seen, she said, her voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying a depth that reached beyond the surface of her words. I make things clean, I make things run, I make sure everything looks the way it is supposed to look. And a few expressions shifted, recognition flickering in places where it had not existed before. And that is fine. She continued, not defensive, not bitter, just honest. Because work is work, and dignity does not come from where you stand in a room. And she let that thought settle before finishing. But respect should not depend on whether or not someone thinks you belong there. And now the silence was different, no longer uncertain but full, heavy in a way that demanded acknowledgement. And she could feel it in the way people held their breath, in the way their attention remained fixed, not out of obligation, but because they could not look away. And for the first time since she had stepped into the ballroom, the room was not defining her, it was responding to her, and she felt that shift clearly, not as power in the traditional sense, but as presence, as something that could not be dismissed or reduced to a label or a role. And she allowed herself one more glance toward Ethan, just a brief moment, enough to see that his composure had changed, that something behind his calm exterior had been unsettled, and she did not linger on it, because this was not about him anymore, not in this moment, and she returned her focus to the audience, her voice steady as she reached the point she had been building toward without ever raising it. You paid for a night, she said quietly, the words simple but clear, but you do not get to decide my worth. And the statement landed in the room with a weight that could not be softened, because it was not directed at one person, it was directed at everyone who had watched, who had judged, who had remained silent when it was easier than speaking, and for a brief second there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the stillness of a room confronted with something real. And then, somewhere in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that what had just happened could not be undone, that the night had changed in a way no one had planned for. And as Amara stood there, her posture steady, her expression calm, she understood that whatever came next would not erase this moment, because the truth, once spoken, had a way of staying, lingering in the spaces people thought they controlled, waiting to be remembered long after the lights dimmed and the room returned to its carefully constructed version of normal. For a moment, nothing happened, and that nothing felt louder than any applause ever could, stretching across the room like a held breath that no one knew how to release. And Amara stood still behind the microphone, not rushing to fill the silence, not softening what she had already said, because she understood that this pause mattered just as much as her words. And in that stillness, something began to shift, subtle at first, almost invisible, a flicker in someone's expression, a glance exchanged between two guests who suddenly seemed unsure of where to look. And then it came, not from the center of the room but from somewhere off to the side, a single clap, sharp and clear, cutting through the silence in a way that made everyone turn, and for a second it stood alone, isolated, as if waiting to see whether it would be accepted or ignored. And then another followed, and another, until the sound began to build, not into the polite, measured applause that had filled the room earlier, but into something less controlled, less predictable, something that carried weight because it had not been planned. And Amara felt it rise around her, not as validation, not as approval, but as recognition, as a response that acknowledged what had just happened without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept. And she did not smile, did not bow her head, did not perform gratitude for something that was not hers to give. She simply stood there, steady, present, allowing the moment to exist without altering it. And across the room, Ethan moved for the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, his posture shifting, his gaze no longer distant but fixed on her with an intensity that had not been there before. And for a brief second their eyes met, and something passed between them, not spoken, not defined, but unmistakable, a realization perhaps, or the beginning of one. And then the applause began to settle, not fading entirely but softening into a murmur of voices that quickly followed, conversations breaking out in low tones, not the same as before, not as polished or controlled, but filled with something else, something closer to uncertainty. And Amara stepped back from the microphone, her hands steady as she released the podium, the physical act of moving away from the center grounding her in a way that nothing else had. And as she turned, the host approached her again, the same smile in place, but now carrying a different edge, one that suggested the script had been altered in a way they had not anticipated. "Thank you," the host said, the words polite, expected, but lacking the ease they had carried earlier. And Amara nodded once, acknowledging without engaging, because she understood that whatever role they had intended for her in this moment had already been redefined. And as she stepped down from the stage, the room felt different beneath her feet, not because the space had changed, but because the way it responded to her had. The glances no longer dismissive but searching, the whispers no longer certain but questioning, and she could feel it in the way people made space for her now, not out of courtesy but out of awareness, as if they were recalibrating something they had not realized needed adjusting. And she moved through them with the same steady pace she had carried onto the stage, not rushing, not lingering, simply existing in the space she had claimed without asking for permission. And when she reached Ethan, he did not speak immediately, did not offer the kind of controlled response she had come to expect from him. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the role he had assigned. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, less certain. "That was not part of the plan," he said, and for a moment the words hung between them, not as criticism but as acknowledgement. And Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unwavering. "No," she replied simply, and there was no apology in her tone, no justification, just truth. And something in that answer seemed to settle into him, not comfortably, not immediately, but deeply enough to matter, and he exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the control he had carried throughout the evening had shifted. "You changed the room," he said, and it was not a question, not even fully a statement, more like an observation he was still trying to understand. And Amara glanced briefly around them, taking in the altered energy, the way conversations continued but with a different undercurrent, the way people now looked at her with something closer to recognition than dismissal. And she turned back to him, her voice steady. "No," she said again, just as simply. The room changed itself, and for a second he said nothing, as if processing the distinction, as if realizing that what had happened was not something she had imposed, but something she had revealed. And that realization seemed to land in a way that left him without an immediate response. And as they stood there, side by side but no longer defined by the same agreement that had brought them together, Amara felt the weight of the night shift once more, not away from her, but towards something she could not yet fully see, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment. And she knew, with a clarity that settled quietly but firmly, that whatever came next would not be controlled by the same rules that had defined the beginning of this evening. Because once something real had been spoken, it did not simply disappear when the music resumed and the lights dimmed. It stayed, shaping everything that followed in ways no one could fully predict. The music returned slowly, not all at once, but in careful layers, as if the room itself needed time to remember how to move again after being forced to feel something it had not planned for. And Amara could sense the shift in the air, not a return to normal, but an attempt to rebuild it, to smooth over the moment with familiar rhythms and practiced smiles. And people resumed their conversations, but the tone had changed, quieter, more deliberate, as if every word now carried the awareness of what had just been said out loud. And she stood beside Ethan for a moment longer before taking a small step back, not away from him, but away from the version of the night that had defined her place next to him. And he noticed it immediately, his eyes following the movement, his expression still searching for something he could not quite name. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them. And Amara met his gaze without hesitation. "I am stepping out of a role," she said simply, and there was no edge in her tone, no anger, just clarity, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, because it was not something he could negotiate or control, and for a second he looked like he might say something more, might try to pull the moment back into something structured, but he did not, and that silence, unlike the others before, felt different, not empty but reflective, as if he was beginning to understand the weight of what had changed, and Amara turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the same steady composure she had carried all evening, and began to walk toward the edge of the room. The movement subtle enough not to draw attention, but deliberate enough to signal that she was no longer anchored to the space beside him. And as she moved, she felt the eyes again, but they were not the same as before, no longer dismissive or curious in the same way. Now they carried something closer to awareness, to recognition, and she could feel it in the way people shifted slightly as she passed, not making way out of politeness, but out of something more instinctive, as if they understood that she occupied a different place in the room now, one that had not been assigned to her but claimed, and she reached a quieter corner near the tall windows where the city lights stretched out beyond the glass, distant and constant. A reminder that the world outside this room continued without needing to be impressed or convinced, and she allowed herself a breath there, just a moment to feel the distance between who she had been when she arrived and who she was now. And it was not a transformation in the way people might expect, not a sudden change or a dramatic shift, but something more subtle, more grounded, like a line that had been drawn and then crossed. And as she stood there, she heard footsteps approach, measured, familiar, and she did not need to turn to know it was Ethan, because his presence carried a kind of quiet certainty that was hard to ignore, and when he stopped beside her, there was a pause, not awkward but deliberate, as if he was choosing his words more carefully than before. "You did not have to do that," he said finally. And Amara looked out at the city for a second longer before responding. "Yes, I did," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in that answer even if he did not fully understand it yet. And for a moment they stood there in silence, the noise of the gala softened by distance, the reflections of light on the glass shifting with every movement behind them. And then he spoke again, his tone different now, less controlled, more uncertain. "I thought I understood how this would go," he admitted, and there was no arrogance in the statement, no defense, just honesty. And Amara turned to face him then, her expression steady. "You understood your part," she said, "not mine," and the words landed between them with a quiet weight, not accusatory but precise, and he held her gaze, absorbing it, and something in his posture shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the certainty he had carried into this night was no longer intact. And as they stood there, the distance between them no longer defined by status or agreement, but by something less clear, less structured, Amara became aware of another presence approaching, lighter, more deliberate, and when she turned slightly, she saw the woman in the silver dress again, her smile still in place, but her expression now more measured, more careful, as if she had recalibrated her approach after what had just happened. "That was quite a moment," the woman said, her voice smooth but no longer edged with the same casual superiority, and Amara met her gaze calmly. "It was honest," she replied, and the woman's smile shifted slightly, not disappearing but softening, as if she was reassessing the dynamic entirely. "Honesty is rare in rooms like this," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood more than she was willing to admit. And for a brief second the three of them stood there, the space between them no longer defined by the same assumptions that had existed earlier. And then the woman inclined her head slightly, a gesture that carried more respect than her earlier words had, before stepping away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the ones before, less heavy, less uncertain, and Amara watched her go before turning back toward the window, her reflection faint against the city lights, and she realized then that the night was not over, not in the way that mattered, because what had begun as a simple agreement had already unraveled into something far more complex, something that could not be contained within the Boundaries they had set at the beginning, and as she stood there, aware of the shifting currents around her, she understood that the next part of this night would not be about proving anything to anyone else, but about deciding what she was willing to accept now that she had seen the truth of the room and the people within it, including the man who stood beside her, no longer just the one who had made an offer, but someone who was now being forced to confront what that offer had truly meant. "Tell me something I do not know," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying less certainty than before, as if he had stepped into unfamiliar ground and was no longer sure how to stand on it. And Amara did not answer immediately, not because she did not have anything to say, but because she understood that what he was asking was not about information, it was about perspective, about a truth he had never needed to see until now. And she turned slightly, her reflection in the glass merging with the lights of the city beyond, creating a faint double image that seemed to echo the space between who she was and how she had been seen all night. "You think control makes things fair," she said finally, her tone calm, measured, not accusing, just clear, and he frowned slightly, not defensive but thoughtful, as if the statement had reached him in a way he was not used to. "Control keeps things organized," he replied, and there was a quiet confidence in his words, but it was not as solid as it had been earlier, not as unquestioned, and Amara nodded once, acknowledging the logic without accepting it fully. "Organized for who?" she asked, and the question hung between them, simple but precise, and for a moment he did not answer, not because he did not understand but because he was realizing the answer was not as straightforward as he had always believed, and the silence that followed was not empty but active, filled with the kind of reflection that did not come easily to someone who had spent most of his life being certain. And behind them the gala continued, the music rising again, conversations rebuilding into something that resembled the earlier rhythm but never quite reaching the same level of ease, as if the room itself was still adjusting to the shift that had taken place. And Amara turned away from the window then, facing him fully, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. "You said after tonight everything goes back to the way it was," she said, not as a question but as a reminder, and Ethan nodded slowly. "That was the agreement," he said, and there was a trace of something in his voice now, something closer to hesitation than certainty, and she held his gaze for a moment longer before continuing. "But that only works if nothing actually changes," she said, and the truth of that statement settled into the space between them with a weight that neither of them could ignore, because they both knew that something had changed, not just in the room but in the way they were standing there now, no longer defined by the same boundaries that had existed before. And Ethan exhaled quietly, his hand moving slightly as if he was about to adjust something, his cuff, his posture, something familiar that would bring him back to a place of control, but he stopped halfway, letting the movement fall away. "What do you want?" he asked then, and this time the question was direct, unfiltered, not shaped by expectation or assumption, and Amara studied him for a second, not searching for the right answer but deciding whether the question itself was genuine, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded in something deeper than the moment. "I want to not be an exception," she said, and his expression shifted slightly, confusion mixed with something else, something that suggested he was trying to understand the full meaning behind her words, and she continued, "I do not want to walk into a room and have to prove that I deserve to be there," she said, her tone steady, not emotional but firm. "I do not want respect to depend on whether someone decides I fit their expectations." And as she spoke, the weight of her words did not rise in volume but in clarity, each sentence building on the last without needing emphasis, and Ethan listened, really listened, his usual instinct to respond replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, and when she finished, there was a pause, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that whatever he said next mattered in a way it had not before, and he glanced briefly back at the room, at the people who had returned to their conversations, their laughter, their carefully maintained version of the evening, and then back at her, and for the first time since the night began, his voice carried something that was not entirely controlled. "I did not see it," he admitted, and the honesty in that statement was not dramatic, not emphasized, but it was real, and Amara nodded slightly, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging the truth of it. "No," she said, "you did not have to." and the simplicity of her response seemed to land harder than anything else, because it removed the idea of blame and replaced it with something more difficult, responsibility. And as they stood there, the distance between them no longer defined by status or agreement, but by understanding, Amara reached into her bag slowly, her movements deliberate, and pulled out the envelope he had given her earlier, the same one that had carried so much weight just hours ago, and she held it for a moment, feeling the shift in its meaning, before extending it toward him. "This was never the point," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and Ethan looked at it, not reaching for it immediately, his gaze moving from the envelope to her face and back again, as if he was trying to reconcile what it represented with what had happened since. And when he finally took it, his grip was slower, more careful, as if the action itself carried a significance he had not anticipated. And the moment lingered there, quiet but full, and Amara lowered her hand, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and she realized then that whatever came next would not be dictated by the agreement they had started with, because that agreement no longer held the same meaning. And as the music swelled again behind them, filling the space with something that tried to restore the illusion of normalcy, Amara understood that the night had already crossed a line that could not be undone, and that the next decision, whatever it would not be about money or roles or expectations, but about whether either of them was willing to step into a version of reality that did not come with the comfort of control. The envelope rested between Ethan's fingers longer than it should have, as if its weight had changed without anyone touching it. And for the first time that night, he did not look like a man who knew exactly what to do next, and Amara noticed it, not with satisfaction but with clarity, because this was not about winning or losing. It was about something shifting in a space that had never required him to question himself before. And the music behind them rose again, brighter now, almost insistent, as if the room was trying to reclaim its rhythm, to pull everything back into something predictable. And yet that small corner by the window felt untouched by it, suspended in a moment that refused to blend back into the rest of the evening. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, not because he needed to lower it, but because something in him had changed the way he used it. "Keep it," he said, extending the envelope back toward her, not with authority but with hesitation, as if the gesture itself required reconsideration. And Amara looked at it without reaching, her gaze steady, not rejecting, not accepting, simply understanding. "If I take it now, it means nothing changed," she said, and her tone carried no accusation, just truth. And he paused, the envelope still suspended between them, and slowly lowered his hand, as if acknowledging that the rules he had relied on no longer applied in the same way. And for a moment neither of them moved, the distance between them no longer defined by status or agreement, but by something more uncertain, something that had not been negotiated or planned. And then a voice approached from behind, smooth, controlled, carrying just enough volume to be heard without seeming intrusive. "Ethan, the board is asking for you." And they both turned to see a man in a tailored suit, his expression polite but firm, the kind of presence that suggested responsibility, expectation, and a reminder that the world Ethan belonged to had not paused simply because something unexpected had happened. And Ethan nodded slightly, the reflex immediate, ingrained, and yet he did not move right away, his attention lingering on Amara as if the decision to step away carried more weight than usual. "I will be there in a minute," he said, and the man inclined his head before stepping back, leaving the two of them once again in a space that felt separate from the rest of the room. And Amara watched Ethan for a second, noticing the hesitation, the way he seemed to be balancing two versions of himself, the one who was expected to lead, to manage, to maintain control, and the one who had just been forced to see something he had never needed to before. And she spoke before he could, her voice calm, grounded. "You should go," she said, and there was no distance in her tone, no attempt to push him away, just a recognition of reality. And he exhaled slowly, as if the simplicity of her words made the choice clearer. "And you?" he asked, not as a demand but as a question, and she glanced back toward the room, the lights, the people who had returned to their conversations but not entirely to their certainty, and then back at him. "I will decide what this night means for me," she said, and something in that answer settled into him, Not completely understood, not fully resolved, but accepted in a way that mattered, and he nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more acknowledgement than anything he had said before, and then he turned, stepping back into the structure of the evening, into the expectations that had always defined his role, and as he walked away, Amara watched for a moment, not with attachment, but with awareness, because she understood that whatever was happening now would unfold differently for each of them, shaped by the choices they made after this moment, and she turned back toward the window, the city lights still steady beyond the glass, unchanged by anything that had happened inside, and she allowed herself a breath, a quiet moment to feel the weight of everything that had shifted, and then she moved, not toward the stage, not toward the center of the room, but toward the edge, toward the space where she could leave on her own terms, and as she walked, the room responded again, subtle but undeniable. The glances no longer questioning but acknowledging, the whispers no longer uncertain but reflective, and she realized that what she had done was not just spoken words into a microphone. It had altered something in the way she was seen, not by everyone, not completely, but enough to matter, and as she reached the exit, the same doors that had once felt like a barrier now opened without hesitation, the guard stepping aside without a word, his posture different, his gaze no longer dismissive, and she stepped through, the cool night air meeting her once again, sharper now, clearer, and for a moment she stood there, just outside the glow of the building, feeling the quiet contrast between the world inside and the one beyond it, and she knew that whatever came next, whether Ethan understood it fully or not, whether that room remembered it or tried to forget, she had already taken something back that no amount of money could have given her, and as she began to walk away, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, she did not look back, because she understood that the most important part of the night was not what had happened under the lights, but what she chose to carry with her once she stepped out of them. The night air felt different now, not colder but clearer, as if something had been stripped away inside her and left only what mattered, and Amara walked without rushing, her heels echoing softly against the pavement, each step steady, grounded, carrying her further from the glow of the gala and everything it had tried to define, and yet she did not feel like she was leaving something behind, not in the way she had expected earlier, because the weight she carried with her now was not doubt or uncertainty, but something quieter, something stronger, a sense of clarity that settled deep and refused to be shaken. And as she reached the corner of the street, she paused for a moment, glancing back not at the building itself, but at the light spilling from it, the movement of silhouettes behind the glass, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. And for a second, she wondered how long it would take for the room to return fully to its version of normal, how long before her words became a moment people referenced casually, something to discuss, and then move past, and she realized it did not matter, because the part of the night that belonged to her was already complete, already carried forward in the way she stood, the way she had spoken, the way she had chosen herself in a space that had not been built for her, and the sound of a car pulling up behind her broke her thoughts, smooth and familiar, and she turned slightly, not surprised to see the same driver stepping out, his expression neutral, but his presence intentional. "Miss Johnson," he said, opening the door with the same quiet professionalism as before, and she looked at him for a moment, considering the gesture, the unspoken assumption that her night was not yet finished, that there was still somewhere she was expected to go, and before she could respond, another door opened, and Ethan stepped out, his jacket slightly undone now, his posture less rigid than it had been earlier, as if the evening had shifted more than just the room, and for a brief second they stood facing each other in the open air, no longer surrounded by chandeliers or expectations, just two people in a space that did not demand performance. And he spoke first, his voice carrying none of the distance it had held before. "I was not finished," he said, and the words were simple but carried a weight that had nothing to do with control or arrangement. And Amara studied him for a moment, noticing the difference not just in his tone, but in the way he stood, the way he held himself without the same certainty that had defined him earlier. And she tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not defensive, just curious. "Finished with what?" she asked, and he exhaled slowly, as if the answer required more honesty than he was used to giving. "Understanding," he said, and there was No attempt to soften it. No attempt to frame it as something else. Just a straightforward admission that felt unfamiliar but necessary. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet of the street stretching around them. The distant sounds of the city moving in the background. And Amara crossed her arms lightly. Not as a barrier, but as a way to hold her ground. "That is not something you pay for," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. And Ethan nodded once, immediately, without argument, as if he had already realized that truth before stepping out of the car. "I know," he said, and the simplicity of that response carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it acknowledged the shift without trying to control it. And she watched him carefully, searching not for perfection but for sincerity, and something in his expression, in the way he stood there without the shield of expectation, suggested that he was no longer trying to manage the moment, but to meet it, and that changed something, not in the past but in what came next, and she let the silence linger for a second longer before speaking again. "Then why are you here?" she asked, and the question was not sharp but clear, direct in a way that left no room for assumption. And Ethan met her gaze fully, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Because walking away would be easier," he said. "And I do not think easy is the same as right anymore." And the words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but honest in a way that felt different from anything he had said earlier that night. And Amara considered that, not rushing to respond, not filling the space with immediate reaction, because she understood that what mattered now was not what he said, but what he would choose to do next. And she glanced briefly at the car, the open door still waiting, the driver standing by with quiet patience, a reminder that the world of structure and expectation was still there, still available, still easy to return to. And then she looked back at Ethan, her expression thoughtful, steady. "Then do not walk away," she said. And the simplicity of her words carried more meaning than anything else could have, because it was not an invitation, not a promise, just a choice placed clearly in front of him. And for a moment he did not move, as if the weight of that choice required more than instinct, more than habit. And then he stepped forward, not toward the car, not back toward the building, but toward her, closing the distance in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, and real. And in that moment, standing under the open sky instead of beneath chandeliers, Amara realized that whatever this night had started, it was no longer about a contract, or a role, or an arrangement. It was about whether two people could step out of the expectations that had defined them and choose something different, something unstructured, something honest. And as the city moved quietly around them, she understood that the answer to that question was not something that would be decided in a single moment, but something that would unfold with every step they chose to take from here. The city did not pause for them, and that was what made the moment feel real. The distant hum of traffic, the quiet glow of streetlights stretching down the block, the cool air settling around them without expectation or judgment. And Amara stood there, steady, grounded, no longer defined by the room she had just left or the role she had been asked to play. And Ethan stood across from her, close enough to be present, far enough to understand that this space between them was not something he could simply step through without meaning it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence itself carried something important, something honest, something that had not existed earlier that night when everything had been structured and predictable. And Amara finally broke it, her voice calm, not distant but clear. "What happens next is not about what you say," she said. And Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had already begun to understand that, as if he knew that whatever came now would be measured in actions, not intentions. And he glanced briefly back toward the building, the light still spilling from its entrance, the world he had always known waiting just a few steps behind him, and then back at her. And in that moment, the choice became visible, not dramatic, not announced, but real, because he did not turn around, did not step back into the comfort of expectation. Instead, he stayed where he was, in the uncertainty, in the space that required him to be something other than what he had always been. And Amara saw it, not as a grand gesture, but as a beginning. And she let out a quiet breath, not relief, not resolution, just recognition, because beginnings were not supposed to be loud. They were supposed to be intentional. And she shifted her weight slightly, her posture still strong, still certain, and looked down briefly at her wrist, at the thin plastic band that still read staff, the same word, that had followed her through every glance, every whisper, every assumption, and slowly, without ceremony, she reached up and unclasped it, the small click almost inaudible against the quiet of the street, and she held it in her hand for a moment, feeling its lightness, its insignificance now compared to what it had represented just hours ago. And then she slipped it into her bag, not throwing it away, not discarding it, but choosing where it belonged, and Ethan watched the movement, understanding its meaning without needing it explained, and something in his expression shifted again, not confusion this time, but clarity, and he spoke, his voice steady but no longer controlled in the same way. "I do not want to go back to before tonight," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight because they were not part of any plan, not part of any agreement, just a truth he had reached on his own, and Amara met his gaze, her expression thoughtful, not softened, not hardened, just open in a way that allowed the moment to exist without forcing it into something more. "Then do not," she replied, and there was no promise in her tone, no guarantee, just the same honesty she had carried all night, and for a second that was enough to acknowledge the shift, enough to recognize that whatever this was, it would not be defined by what had happened earlier, but by what they chose moving forward, and the driver remained by the car, silent, patient, the door still open as if offering a path back into something familiar, and Ethan glanced at it once more before shaking his head slightly, a small gesture, but one that carried finality, and the driver understood without needing words, stepping back and closing the door, the soft sound echoing lightly before fading into the background, and the car pulled away, leaving them standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the open night around them, and Amara felt it then, the full shift of the evening settling into place, not as an ending, but as a turning point, something that would not be undone by time or distance, and she took a step forward, not toward him, not away from him, but into the street ahead, and after a brief pause, Ethan followed, matching her pace without trying to lead, without trying to define the direction, just moving beside her in a way that felt different from anything earlier that night. And as they walked, the city lights stretched out before them, not as a destination, but as possibility, and for the first time since the night began, Amara did not feel like she was stepping into someone else's world or being measured against it. She felt like she was simply walking forward, on her own terms, with someone who was still learning what that meant, and she knew it would not be easy, that understanding did not come all at once, that change required more than a single moment, but she also knew that something real had started, something that did not need a contract or a number to define it, and as the distance between them and the gala grew, the light behind them fading into the background, she realized that the most important part of the night was not what had been said on the stage, or what had been offered across a table, but what had been chosen here, in the quiet, in the space where no one was watching, and as they disappeared into the rhythm of the city, side by side but unbound by anything except the choices they would continue to make, the story of that night did not end. It simply became something else, something that would be remembered not for the moment it shocked a room, but for the way it changed two people who chose to see each other clearly for the first time.